So I want to talk right now about the metal genre of music. About metal broadly speaking, including the history of metal, um, the distinction between old versus new types of metal. New as in NEW, not NU, although it would include NU. But my favorite subgenres and bands, and ultimately like the decline of metal and what can be done to revive it today, and also just kind of like the problems within metal as a genre and metal culture. So I know there's been plenty of videos already about the history of metal on YouTube. Like Serp has a really good video about it. Occulturation has a ton of videos on this subject. So I don't want to go too much into all the very specific details about all the subgenres. I really want to more provide a basic outline of the history of metal as I see it. So the way I see it, metal has broadly speaking two different eras in a more broad sense, and I would say either five or six different eras in a more specific sense. Like if you're going to subdivide it into more specific lines. And metal has existed since 1970 when Black Sabbath came out with its eponymous album Black Sabbath. So that's over 55 years now that metal has existed. And it's existed long enough that many of the older metal band members, those who are still alive, are getting into their 70s now. I think the oldest major figure in metal, if he was still alive today, Dio would be in his 80s if he was still alive. I think he was born in 1942, around then. So I think as far as like more major figures within metal go, I think he was the oldest in terms of when he was born. I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah. So my point is, metal has been around quite a while now. So when looking at it in a broad sense, I would say the two major eras, like putting the eras into kind of overarching categories, would be older and newer, like old head metal versus new head metal. And newer is kind of in quotation marks because at this point, many of the newer stuff is already fairly old, and the people who grew up listening to it in the target demographic are now in their 30s and 40s. So I really put newer in quotation marks. But broadly speaking, there's no exact line between newer and older metal. But I would say this. Generally speaking, everything from the 70s and 80s is older. Everything from roughly 95, 96 onward is newer. But there's an ambiguous gray area in between where the dominant forms of metal were kind of in between older and newer, and it's sort of a transitional phase. So that was the era of, for instance, like 1990, 95, when like Pantera was the dominant metal band at the time. And then you also had bands that are sort of in the periphery of what would be considered metal, like, say, Alice in Chains and Soundgarden in grunge. Personally, I think Alice in Chains is definitely metal. I don't think being metal and grunge are mutually exclusive. Soundgarden's a bit more iffy. They have a few songs that are definitely metal, like Jesus Christ Pose, but I wouldn't say as a whole that they're necessarily a metal band. But my point is, okay, during that time period, it was a transitional time period. So you had bands like Rage Against the Machine, Faith No More, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, and they're sort of in the gray area in terms of whether they're metal or not, like between metal and rock. And then you have bands, we'll say Pantera, for instance, which is definitely metal, which was prominent in that era. I would say Sepultura was also quite prominent in that era. Now, Sepultura has more in common with older forms of metal because it started as a thrash band, very much, and then became more groove metal. And groove metal, I think, is really the dominant style of this transitional period. As Pantera and Sepultura are both part of this genre. And yes, obviously, Pantera did start as like a hair metal band, but nobody really gives a shit about that era of Pantera anymore, so it's kind of irrelevant. Whereas Sepultura, on the other hand, their thrash era, like prior to Chaos AD, very much still relevant. It's considered a lot of their best work. But I am getting ahead of myself a little bit here. I'm just sort of trying to talk about the transitional era first before I really talk about the old and new. And really, I should start with the old. So I should start with this chronologically. And also, as a side note, okay, defining the difference between metal and rock, I think, is crucial because metal, after all, comes from rock. Is that true in a geological sense too? I don't know. But in the musical sense, metal comes from rock. Metal evolved from rock. And the line between rock and metal, it's extremely blurry. It's amorphous, and numerous bands straddle that line constantly and cross it constantly, and there is no firm line. And you know what? That's fine. You know why? Because a lot of the best bands sit on that line. A lot of the best bands that kick the most ass sit right on the line between rock and metal, and that's totally fine. Saying a band is rock, not metal, is not an insult. There are a lot of great rock bands. A lot of rock music kicks ass. It rocks. But I think defining the difference between metal and rock, I think there's 4 key characteristics that go into what makes it metal. And I have to say, to be metal, it doesn't have to fill all 4 of these characteristics. Many metal bands don't. But I think it has to fulfill at least 1 or 2. And if it fulfills all 4, it's almost definitely metal, as opposed to rock. So I would say the 4 characteristics are heaviness, speed, darkness, and technicality. I would say those are typically the 4 traits that differentiate metal from rock. It's heavier, it's darker, it's more technical, and it's faster. Now, obviously, not all these are true for every metal band, but what I'm saying is, for something to be metal rather than rock, it probably fulfills at least 1 or 2 of these things. It's either quite heavy, quite dark, quite fast, or quite technical. Now, obviously, rock music can be some of these things. Like some rock music is very technical, for instance. Some rock music can be fairly dark. Some rock music can be fairly fast, although I'd say it's rare for rock to get as fast as metal at its quickest. In terms of heaviness, I would say past a certain threshold, it pretty much is metal, with the exception of hardcore punk. Now, hardcore punk is frankly, a bit confusing and frustrating, its existence, simply because it's sort of like the expression, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. But hardcore punk basically fulfills more or less all the criteria of being metal, but yet it's not considered metal. It's considered a separate genre because it kind of evolved in a separate way in a separate scene. But to make things more complicated, these days we have post-hardcore also, and we have metal genres like metalcore that blur the line between hardcore or post-hardcore and metal. And it gets very confusing and very blurry. Like, what is hardcore or post-hardcore and what is metal? It's very blurry, and a lot of it sounds very similar and fulfills similar criteria. So I'd argue it does, to some extent, show that, like, there's not an objective definition in all cases, and it can be a social construct, because there probably are hardcore or post-hardcore bands that fill 3 or 4 of those criteria and yet are considered hardcore or post-hardcore as opposed to metal. Like I'd say Alexis on Fire probably fulfills at least like 3 out of those 4 criteria, for instance. And there is also like crossover thrash, which is literally crossover between hardcore punk and thrash. And so again, like thrash metal. And again, like there's there's plenty of overlap between the two, and it does get really confusing. So the point is, yeah, I mean, you can't define metal 100%, but I think you can lay out certain rules that help you define it. And I think, again, like hardcore punk and post-hardcore is such a major exception to the rule that it has to be noted, simply because it's something that's so similar but yet is not technically considered metal. But anyway, yeah, okay, now that I've kind of defined the difference between well, just to go a little bit more into it, when I talk about these 4 criteria, like I think, for instance, like a band like, let's say, old school Metallica would fulfill all 4 of these. It's dark, heavy, technical, and fast. Whereas, say, for instance, some new metal might be like heavy and dark, but not technical or fast. But most people would still consider it metal, or at least some would. It does get iffy. Like it definitely gets iffy. As to like, or like say Tool. Tool would be heavy, dark, and technical, but not necessarily fast. A lot of doom metal would be like that. It would be heavy and dark, but sometimes technical, but not fast. So again, like, I mean, it doesn't have to fulfill all 4 criteria, but generally I would say it probably should fulfill usually at least 2 or 3 to be metal. But I'm sure there's exceptions. There's probably some metal band out there that only fulfills 1 or 0 of those criteria, but is still considered metal. I can't think of any. I suppose Alcest, like, might only fulfill like 1.5 of those criteria, because it'd be like, it's technical, and I guess occasionally it can be heavy, but it's not really that dark, and it's not really that fast. And usually it's not heavy, but sometimes it is. So like it would really only be like 1 and slightly more than 1 of those criteria that it would fulfill. Like, to be honest, the fact that they have growls is probably one of the only reasons they're considered metal, but they are a great band. So regardless, yeah, that's okay. So that's kind of my attempt to define the difference between rock and metal. Before we go on now, regarding the history of metal. So as I mentioned, there's kind of the old and the new school of metal, and then there's that kind of in-between phase between 1990 and 1995, which was when groove and grunge kind of, yeah, the 2 GRs kind of dominated. Grrr. Yeah, it makes people grrr with frustration because you can't pigeonhole it as either old school or new school. So, yeah, those are the main eras of metal, but you could divide it much more into smaller categories. However, before I do that, I'm going to talk about kind of the defining characteristics of old school versus new school metal in the broader sense. So, in my opinion, old school metal kind of tends to be defined by it's more pure metal. It doesn't fuse it as much with other genres, with the exception of like some of the earlier stuff fuses it with like hard rock, which is kind of what led to metal. But it doesn't like, it's not as experimental. It doesn't like start fusing it with all kinds of like really far out weird stuff that's like not even close to metal. Usually in old school metal, clean vocals, like whereas singing as opposed to growling, tend to dominate more so. Toward the later stages, growls start coming into the equation, but I would say overall old school metal is more dominated by singing. I would say most old school metal bands have a consistent level of heaviness, at least throughout the same album or the same song. They may evolve as they go on. Like Judas Priest, for instance, gradually became heavier as they went on. You can kind of see the progression from one album to the next. But within the same album, and especially within the same song, it's usually a consistent level of heaviness. Whereas like newer school metal bands, on the other hand, are the opposite. They tend to be all over the place. But I'll get into that more when I talk about them. I would say old school metal sometimes tends to be faster with like, say, like thrash and speed metal and power metal, although it's not always the case, but I would say often tends to be faster. There's more of a sense of controlled rage as opposed to like uncontrolled rage. Um, it's sort of stoic, but with an undertone of anger. Um, Basically, it's hyper masculine. Like there's more of a sense of masculinity, of this sense of like masculine controlled wrath being the dominant emotion behind it. And in line with that, really anger, this, and usually this controlled sense of anger is really the only emotion large expressed. Like it doesn't get that emotional in other sense, like with like sadness, for instance. Like if you're picturing the emotions from Inside Out, sadness has been banished. She's in the corner crying somewhere. She's not in this genre, this era of metal. With a few exceptions. Like, obviously, yeah, there's songs like Fade to Black by Metallica and One by Metallica, but these are the exception, they're not the rule. Those songs were actually fairly experimental for their time and were a bit unusual for old school metal. They'd be more typical of newer school metal, but again, the exceptions that prove the rule. By and large, old school metal, it wasn't as emotional. It's more masculine, like hyper masculine, and the only acceptable emotion is anger, and it's usually a more controlled sense of anger, which again brings like the stoicism element. There's hard rock. There's a lot of hard rock influence, a lot of old school punk influence, and I would say, yeah, all that I would say those are the defining characteristics of old school metal, broadly speaking. Now, new school metal is the opposite for many of these traits. It mixes itself with other genres all the time. So there's electronic elements, there's classical elements, there's bands that at times can sound like Radiohead, at times can sound like Radiohead or Pink Floyd. Like with psychedelic or post-rock elements. There's just a lot of experimentalism. There's like emo and screamo elements. Like there's just all kinds of like experimenting with other genres, mixing in elements of genres that aren't metal at all, really. In line with that, there's often a progressive undertone, like proggy. So like, different time signatures, long songs, things of that nature. Like not all stuff that's experimental is proggy, but pretty much all stuff that's proggy is at least somewhat experimental. Talking about the types of emotions, the emotional range is much wider. So you could say it's more feminine in that regard. That's what Occulturation was saying, and I kind of agree that it's not always feminine per se, but there is a wider range of emotions in new school metal. So there's like sad, melancholy, and there's also more uncontrolled anger. So when it gets angry, it often gets even angrier compared to old school metal. So yeah, there's more diverse influences in general. The vocals often are harsh, like harsh vocals like death growls and such tend to dominate, but they are often mixed with clean vocals, like often within the same song, and there'll be different levels of heaviness not only within the same band or the same album, but within the same song very often. There are some new school metal bands that have entirely clean vocals, but not as many as with old school. I would say most have at least some kind of growling or screaming as at least part of their vocals. And even the more mainstream ones, like even like if you look at say like Linkin Park, which is very new metal, they're still screaming within Linkin Park's vocals at times. It's not the majority. It might be only like 10% of their vocals, but there is screaming. There's a mix of heavy and soft parts that's characteristic of new school metal. As I said, let's see what else. It can be emo at times. It's not concerned with being pure metal. Like it's okay with being fused with other genres and not always sounding like metal. There's a mix of masculine and feminine influence, masculine and feminine energy. It's not always super stoic. There's rap influence at times, especially in nu metal. Um, Sometimes it can be slower, like sometimes it can be fast, sometimes it can be slow. I would say as a rule, being fast is less important and less necessary for new school metal as opposed to old school metal. It's less of a defining feature. I would also say new school metal came at a time where the more pure forms of metal, like the heavier forms, were starting to become less mainstream, but the less pure forms, less heavy forms of metal were still fairly mainstream, just as much as say for instance Metallica or Megadeth were quite mainstream in the 80s, early 90s, and same with like Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, it's Motorhead beforehand. So in old school metal, like metal could be quite mainstream at times. In new school metal, I would say metal as a whole becomes less mainstream. It gets a bit more underground, a bit more niche, but the less purist types of new school metal, including, yes, new metal, still are fairly mainstream. Like, I think Linkin Park at their peak was quite big. Maybe not quite as big as Metallica at their peak, but still very big. So, like, new metal, for instance, was still quite mainstream, but other more like pure forms of metal were less so. Whereas in old school metal, like metal purists definitely accept like thrash and classic metal, like Judas Priest, like old school Metallica, Megadeth, etc. They purists definitely accept these bands as metal, whereas they often don't accept the new metal, NU metal bands as metal. So during new school metal, broadly speaking, the bands that are more firmly accepted as metal within the metalhead community tend to be less mainstream than the ones that were accepted during the era of old school metal. Like, there's nothing that's like considered definitely metal by metal purists that's from the new school metal era that is anywhere near as big in the mainstream as Metallica or Megadeth or Judas Priest or Black Sabbath. It's not even close. Like, I'd say, I would almost say maybe Tool, but the thing is, I have seen metal purists claim that Tool isn't metal. So, I don't know. And I do think there's some bias to it, to like what is and isn't considered metal. I don't think it's objective, because I think if Black Sabbath had came out with the exact same sound, if they were a new band with the exact same sound and they'd started in like the 2000s or 2010s, a lot of metal purists would be like, no, that's not metal, that's hard rock. But again, it's because of their historical contribution to the metal genre that metal purists, like their place in history, that metal purists unreservedly will consider Black Sabbath a metal band as opposed to a rock band. Even though much of Black Sabbath's material to me sounds more like rock than metal. Not all of it, but especially a lot of their older stuff. Like, I'd say on their very first album, I'd say only about maybe like 2 songs, including the title track, sound more metal than rock to me. A lot of it sounds more like psychedelic classic rock than metal. Again, like as Black Sabbath evolved, like that changed somewhat, but a lot of their earlier material, in my opinion, sounds more rock than metal. There's definitely metal in there though. Like, I definitely agree that the first metal song was Black Sabbath on the eponymous album by the eponymous band. But I'm just saying there's some bias, I think, among metalheads as to who they do and don't consider metal, which has less to do with the actual sound and more to do with like the historical and genre context of when something came out and what scene it was affiliated with. Another reason why I say like Alice in Chains often doesn't get considered metal despite having a very metal sound, because people are like, oh, they're grunge, and grunge was like anti-metal. It was a different genre that was opposed to metal at the time, that was trying to replace metal. Therefore, Alice in Chains can't be metal. Like, again, there's some dispute among fans about that, but I'm just saying that's kind of the rationale behind it. But yeah, all things considered, I would say stuff that is definitely metal became less mainstream in the new school metal era. And more underground, more niche, and in some ways also heavier because of that. I think that making it more niche encouraged it to become heavier and less accessible. For better and for worse, in my opinion, because we got some amazing stuff out of that, but we also got some very unbearable, abrasive shit out of that too. So it goes a bit both ways. So breaking it down, the old school and new school into more specific phases, I think there's 5 or 6. The first would be basically the 70s, which was like dominated by Black Sabbath and Judas Priest. And this was very early stages of metal. It straddled the line between rock and metal at the time. And I would say as these bands matured, they got more firmly into the metal category as they refined the metal sound more and created it. They basically came more and more into what is today considered metal out of this hard rock sound. But yeah, I would say like bands like Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, and Motorhead would define this era. So basically like the 70s and like the very early 80s. I would also lump in Iron Maiden and Dio with this era, even though they came slightly later, because their sound is more specifically tied to this era, tied to like the later part of this era, but definitely influenced by, say, like Judas Priest quite a bit. So yeah, that would be the first era. It's kind of like the 70s and like the very early 80s. I'd say the second era was essentially the 80s and maybe like 1990, 91 sort of. But maybe starting in like, I don't know. Because there is a bit of overlap. Because Venom, I believe they came out with their first album, Welcome to Hell. I think it was 1980, I think. And that was really the album, I think, that kicked off the second era of metal in the more specific sense, because it was basically what pioneered the sound of more of extreme metal, like semi-growled vocals, heavier, faster. Now Venom today, it's interesting, they're very influential, but they aren't regarded as being as good as some of the other bands that they inspired, like compared to like say Slayer, for instance. I don't think Venom is as well liked in terms of their music and how much people consider it like the best of the best, but they were very influential nonetheless. So I think the second era, it was dominated by basically early extreme metal and also thrash metal, but I think especially thrash metal. And it also overlapped with like the later stages of the heyday of traditional metal, which is like the first of these eras. So like there was, I would say with Kill 'Em All in 1983, Metallica sort of really kicked off this era. But I think it was kind of born even earlier with Venom's Welcome to Hell in 1980. But I would say when it really ascended to popularity and eclipsed traditional metal was probably around 1983, 1984, give or take, which is when thrash metal really started to come into its own and dominate the metal scene with like Metallica, but then soon after also Megadeth and Slayer. So I think that was around when the real changing the guard happened, like maybe like 83 to 85, 86. That around that period was when thrash metal really came to dominate. And there was also kind of the earlier extreme metal at the same time. Bands like Morbid Angel, Bathory, Possessed, like kind of some Death even, like the earlier bands to use growls, like kind of like proto-death metal, proto-black metal. And Slayer sort of straddled the line between thrash and extreme metal. I'd say they're more on the side of thrash, but like they are a thrash metal band, but with some extreme metal elements. And many of the the non-big four thrash bands also straddle that line. In some ways go way further than Slayer, like have actual growled vocals, like Testament, later Testament, Exodus, Sodom, Creator, Sepultura. So a lot of the other thrash stuff kind of straddles that line too, where it's both thrash and extreme metal at the same time. So the two aren't mutually exclusive, but what are considered the big four thrash, Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, and Anthrax don't really do growled vocals per se. So that sort of distinguishes them from the more extreme metal of the day. Like, I mean, Slayer has some of their later stuff, I think, just like dabbles a bit into like straight up growls. Like if you listen to the song Divine Intervention off the eponymous album Divine Intervention, I think that actually gets into straight up growls a little bit more, but that's not really considered Slayer's heyday. So yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to say is, like, by and large, okay, so by and large, this era was mostly defined by thrash metal, but also by, like, to a lesser extent, early, like, proto-death, proto-black metal, like early extreme metal. And then the third era would be what I talked about already, this transitional period in the early 90s, so roughly from 1990 to 95 or 96, which was dominated by grunge and like groove metal and grunge. Oh, and before, of course, one thing I forgot to mention already. Okay, during each stage of metal, there's kind of a genre that straddles the line between rock and metal that is also dominant at the time. During the earliest stage, like traditional metal, there's basically hard rock, like stuff like Aerosmith, Van Halen, AC/DC, Scorpions, what have you. During the second era, like the era where thrash metal dominated, it was more like hair metal was that gray area. So, hair metal / glam metal, which kind of evolved from the hard rock of earlier. So bands like, say, like Poison, Rat, White Snake, but also like Guns N' Roses and Skid Row toward kind of the end of that era. And Skid Row was definitely at the heavier end of that, more into like straight up metal. Yeah, and Guns N' Roses was also at the heavier end of that. But yeah, so hair / glam metal was kind of the gray area genre between rock and metal during that second stage. And during this third stage, the transitional stage between the broader speaking, like old school and new school metal, groove metal was the more dominant form of like straight up metal. And groove metal sort of evolved from thrash. So like Cowboys from Hell by Pantera was really the album that set off groove metal. It kind of gave birth to it, and it was an album with many thrash elements. Like Pantera, I think I haven't ever listened to Pantera's earlier stuff before Cowboys from Hell, but I think it's kind of like hair metal sort of. But Cowboys from Hell, there's a lot of thrash elements, and it's kind of like giving birth to the groove metal sound, which is, again, as I said, it's kind of like an offshoot of thrash metal. Like groove metal is kind of like thrash metal, but I guess you could say it's a bit heavier and a bit slower are kind of some of the dominant characteristics. Whereas thrash metal, the dominant characteristics is it's usually fast. It's fast, heavy, and has a lot of hardcore punk influence. Whereas groove metal sort of a bit even heavier, but a bit slower. So that era, 1990 to 95, like the groove metal bands would be like Pantera, which was the biggest straight up metal band at the time. And I would say also Sepultura started becoming more of a groove metal band at the time with Chaos AD, which was released in this time period. I think it was 92 or 93. Yeah. And also at the time grunge was big, and grunge was kind of the gray area at the time, sort of like hair metal and hard rock before it, the gray area between rock and metal. And there was a sense of hostility toward grunge by many metalheads because they felt like grunge was replacing thrash metal in popularity and eclipsing it, even though I think thrash metal was kind of eclipsed in the first place by hair metal, although there was that animosity at the time between thrash and hair metal also. So even though there was a lot of bands that thrash bands that started that had very like hair metal roots, like even Slayer, for instance, had that look to them at first when they started out as a band. But yeah, grunge basically was different, very different from hair metal. It was darker, it was more serious, it was kind of brooding. And I would say it gave way to a lot of genres later on that owe their roots to grunge, like a lot of alternative rock, new metal, post grunge, obviously, but like yeah, a lot of stuff that came afterwards. I think grunge, I think, was what started opening metal and maybe rock even in general to being more emotional in some ways and exploring different types of emotions like sadness, melancholy, etc. So yeah, I think that transitional period, it was really dominated by bands like Pantera and Sepultura, groove metal, but also like grunge. So that would include Alice in Chains and Soundgarden, which are closer to metal, and then other grunge bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam that are, and Stone Temple Pilots that are a bit further from being metal, more like just straight up rock. Although Nirvana can get kind of heavy at times. Even Stone Temple Pilots a bit. Pearl Jam, not so much. But yeah, I'd say the next era after this third one would be the fourth era would be basically 1996 or so, 95 or 96 to about, I don't know. It depends how you define it. Maybe about 2005, give or take. And this era was dominated by nu metal. And yeah, I mean, nu metal, again, takes influence from a lot like rap metal. Like there's some, yeah, one thing I didn't mention that in the third stage, kind of dominated by grunge and groove, there's also like some like proto nu metal, like stuff that sounded like nu metal, but before nu metal existed. So like Rage Against the Machine, for instance, or Faith No More. That incorporates some like rap or funk elements and stuff like that, and just has this like alternative sound, but kind of heavy. Nu metal built upon that, and also upon grunge to an extent, like especially like Alice in Chains definitely influenced nu metal quite a bit. And nu metal again was kind of the genre of this fourth era that straddled the line between rock and metal. I would say the more purest forms of metal, as I said, went a bit more underground, but a lot of what dominated the more purest types of metal in this fourth phase was prog metal, and also melodic death metal. So the prog metal bands of the time would include like Tool, Dream Theater, Opeth, Between the Buried and Me, Mastodon, bands like that. And the melodic death metal would include like Children of Bodom, At the Gates, In Flames, Dark Tranquillity, Soilwork, like a lot of Scandinavian bands specifically. And yeah, that was definitely quite popular at the time within the metal community, like not in a more mainstream sense. I would say also groove metal continued being popular during this time period because Lamb of God is a groove metal band that is huge among metalheads at the time. I'd say in some ways Lamb of God might be the defining metal band of this time period. Yeah, but of the more purest, like the ones that aren't nu metal, like Tool might be the only one that really broke into the mainstream at the time. Which is surprising considering Tool does have long songs, complicated song structures. Frankly, I'm surprised that Tool got as big as they did, although they had a few hit songs that weren't quite as long or complicated, like Schism and Sober and Stinkfist. So maybe that's part of the reason why they got bigger, is those specific songs, and like Vicarious, The Plot. So yeah, but yeah, I'd say that was how that era, like metal was starting to splinter off a lot more during this time period. Like the sheer number of bands was increasing, the number of subgenres. There's a million different obscure subgenres that started existing that I can't even get into them all. Serp's video actually goes into this quite well, like the specific subgenres. But I would say those are the bigger genres at the time. There was also a bit of a revival of thrash and classic metal, like certain bands like Iron Maiden, Sodom, Creator, like starting to come back from those two earliest eras and putting out some new material that actually managed to be quite popular among their fan base. So there's a bit of that going on too. Now, then that's the fourth era. This is where it starts getting really ambiguous. Whether there's a fifth or sixth, like to what extent the new eras exist or where they begin and end. I'd say there might be kind of like a fifth era between, I don't know, maybe between 2005 and maybe like, I don't know, the early 2010s. And this is, I guess, maybe even starting slightly earlier. Like there's some overlap. During this time period, it's very similar to the era beforehand. It's almost a continuation of it. The only thing that's different is I think nu metal kind of falls out of grace and metalcore kind of supplants it. Now, metalcore, I think, was starting to get big even in like the early 2000s, but I think in this era, it really becomes more dominant among metalheads. But metalcore never breaks into the mainstream to the same extent that nu metal did. So I would say this is really the death of metal in the mainstream, this particular era. Aside from a few legacy bands from previous eras, we don't really see any metal bands anymore really breaking out into the mainstream that haven't already. But I'd say, yeah, metalcore was kind of dominant in this era, but also some of the genres that were dominant in the previous era are still chugging along, like say groove metal, melodic death metal, prog metal, even to an extent nu metal, but it has fallen from grace a bit in this time period. Its heyday is clearly over. But a few like legacy bands are still doing well, like say like Deftones, for instance, is still doing quite well in this era. And Tool put out their 10,000 Days album, which was fairly popular. But it's kind of a transitional era, but I actually like a lot of stuff from this time period because I'm really into prog metal. And there's a lot of great prog metal from this period also, as well as the fourth phase before it. So yeah, the phase 5 is kind of a continuation of phase 4. It's not really that different. You could debate whether it should even be its own phase. But I would say after that comes phase 6, which is what I'd consider, sadly, even more so than phase 5, the downfall of metal. This is when we start to get to the point where not only is metal out of the mainstream, but even among metalheads, there aren't really any bands that are widely considered amazing that everyone agrees on. So I'm talking about the time period, like basically maybe 2010, maybe 2010, 2011, 2012, and afterward. What's happening now is not only are we not seeing any new bands like Metallica or Linkin Park that are becoming big among the mainstream, but we're not even seeing really many new bands that are becoming huge within the metalhead community. Like, say, something like Lamb of God or Mastodon or Opeth. Like, I'd say one of the last bands to really become super big among metalheads would be Gojira, and a lot of what's considered their best material was in the phase 5, like mid to late 2000s, and maybe a little bit into like the early 2010s. So by phase 6, even Gojira had been around quite a bit already. So there's some bands that I really like from the phase 6 era, like say Neobliviscaris. Technically, they didn't put out their first major release till 2012. Alcest, well, technically, I think their first album was their first main release was, I think, 2007, 2008, but I think they didn't start becoming bigger until the 2010s. Like, so they're sort of this era. And Black Gaze, which is a sound pioneered by Alcest, I think is one of the few new sounds in this era, because this is what we're starting to see. Really starting with phase 5, like starting around like the mid 2000s, there's fewer new subgenres of metal. A lot of the biggest stuff is from subgenres that already existed. I'd say the last few subgenres to really come out that became even semi-big within metal were Djent and Black Gaze. And Djent, I think, started about midway through the 2000s as a genre, but it was really like Meshuggah that pioneered Djent, and they were starting as early as, I think, like 1995. So I guess Djent started becoming bigger in phase 6 of metal, like bands like Periphery and Tesseract. But at the same time, we're not seeing these bands hitting, never mind like Metallica or Linkin Park numbers of popularity. We're not even seeing them really hit like Lamb of God or Opeth or Children of Bodom levels of popularity and just being renowned within the metalhead community. Like, I was trying to think, what was the last metal album that is like widely regarded, like that is very well known among metalheads and widely regarded as like a classic? And honestly, the most recent one I could think of, and even this one's a bit debatable, would be Crack the Sky by Mastodon, which came out in 2009. So what's happening in the 2010s in this stage 6 is metal's kind of fizzing out a bit. Like, there's some legacy bands that are still doing well. There's a lot of like random underground bands, but it's sort of just starting to lose its way and starting to become less popular and starting to also just produce less hits even within the metalhead community, less stuff that's like iconic. Like, I think there's some good albums in this era, but they tend to be either legacy bands from beforehand or newer bands, but that still sound quite a bit like bands from beforehand. Like, say, Ne Obliviscaris. It's a band that really came into popularity in this era. Like, their first major release was 2012, but they do sound a lot like, as a prog metal band with symphonic elements, they do sound a lot like earlier bands like Opeth, for instance. They kind of sound a lot like Opeth, but with symphonic elements. So it's like, they're a very good band, but I wouldn't say that their sound exactly exemplifies this era. I think they're a band that built a lot on the sound of like the 2000s and late 90s. So yeah, I mean, aside from Black Gaze, and I mean, Black Gaze was a new genre that kind of started in the late 2000s, early 2010s, but I'd argue, like with Alcest especially, but I'd argue that like Black Gaze hasn't really become as big as a lot of earlier subgenres. So it might be the newest recognized subgenre of metal, but it's just not as huge as a lot of the earlier ones. Like, I mean, Alcest and Deaf Heaven just aren't as like big as like, you know, bands from earlier subgenres. So yeah, metal is starting to sort of decline a bit in popularity at this point, and also in terms of just new material that's really making waves within the metalhead community or in the mainstream. There's still some kind of popular stuff by legacy bands like, say, Deftones, Tool, Meshuggah, Gojira, to an extent Mastodon, I guess you could say, like, that are still putting out new material that is fairly well liked by their fan base, but nothing really revolutionary per se. Like, a lot of time it's kind of in the vein of their earlier material. And I would say this era kind of extends into the current era, like the 2020s, because there just haven't been too many new developments. Like, there have been bands like Ghost and Sleep Token that have become very popular among like Gen Z, but a lot of metal purists don't like them that much. I frankly, from what I've heard of them, don't like them that much. And a lot of metalheads would say they're just not great metal, like these bands like Ghosts and Sleep Token. which are probably some of the more recent bands. But even hasn't Ghost been around since like the early 2010s, I think. Um, and Sleep Token is a bit newer. That's like I think they started around the mid 2010s. But again, I'm just a lot of metalheads just don't feel that like, oh, Sleep Token really deserves to be carrying the torch right now. I'd kind of agree with that sentiment. But amidst this downfall of metal, there's also been, especially in more recent years, a resurgence of appreciation for metal bands from before. So both old school and new school, but from like, leading up to the 2010s, basically, like from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. There's been this resurgence of popularity as people start young people start discovering things from previous eras. This, low rung generation, Gen Zers start discovering traditional metal, thrash metal, new metal, groove metal, etc. And you also have certain watershed events like Stranger Things, very popular TV show, had the scene where Eddie was playing Master Puppets by Metallica. That was a scene that really helped popularize thrash metal, like sort of a resurgence in the popularity of thrash metal. And also, of course, Gojira's performance at the Olympics, the Paris Olympics in 2024, I think helped start a resurgence of appreciation for more extreme forms of metal, like Gojira themselves and also similar bands. So I think there's been a resurgence lately of appreciation for metal, but the issue is a lot of these bands are just older bands that, they're not new, and some of them are still putting out new material, but they're either A, they're past their prime, or B, their material's still good, but it's just similar to what they were doing before, and they're not really innovating that much. Like, there haven't been too many metal albums in recent years that I'd call genuinely innovative. Like, maybe Alcest and Deaf Heaven were the last ones with Black Gaze, I don't know, to be truly innovative. A lot of stuff, like, there's been good material by, like, say, like, Deftones, Tool, Neo Oblivious, and various other bands, but a lot of it sounds similar to their earlier material. So I guess what I think is like the way forward for metal, in my opinion, is for metal to sort of make its way into other genres. Like, I think, for instance, if you listen to some of the dark synth, like synthwave, like especially like Perturbator, like their album New Model, it's electronic music, it's synth music, but it sounds very metal inspired at times with like heavy riffs, like heavy electronic riffs. But it is electronic. There's no guitars. It's entirely synthesized, and there's no vocals either. It's entirely instrumental. But I think music like this, if you incorporated vocals, like metal style vocals, could be potentially the new big thing. So it wouldn't actually be metal technically, but it would be like electronic music that is essentially inspired by metal. Like stuff like, New Model by Perturbator, but with metal vocals, like both clean and harsh vocals. Like, I think that kind of thing is the way forward for metal, which is really, it wouldn't technically be metal because it would be electronic music. But I think electronic music that is extremely heavily inspired by metal. And there could be some forms of fusion between, like, we sort of already have that with like industrial metal, like Nine Inch Nails, but I'm talking like more straight up electronic than that. So like more like what Perturbator did, only with vocals, for instance. Because Nine Inch Nails, they still play guitars. Like, it's still guitar driven music. It's filtered through an electronic sound, as opposed to like synthwave, which is just straight up electronic music. To my understanding, that's the difference. So I think that's kind of the way forward for metal, is to sort of like inspire other genres and to make music that sounds like metal, but that is not guitar based, like either electronic based or even like symphonic classical music that's very metal inspired. And I'm not talking about like symphonic metal, which already exists, but like purely symphonic music, like without the guitars, that's just entirely symphonic, but very metal inspired. Personally, I think that's kind of the way forward. Some may disagree. Some may cling to their guitars very much, and I understand that. Cling to their gently weeping guitars. But actually, Steven Wilson, I think, would agree with me on this. He's been talking about this a lot, how he thinks like guitar driven music shouldn't be like isn't the future of music, and how he thinks electronic music is more so. I don't even say I'm not even saying guitar driven music is dead, but I'm saying that I think like to make stuff that sounds new and fresh, I think that for now is the way forward. And who knows? Guitar driven music could make a resurgence in future decades afterward. But personally, in my opinion, I think that's the way forward to make like stuff that actually sounds fresh and innovative and that pushes the ideas behind metal forward, but without maybe kind of, yeah, without technically being metal. That, in my opinion, is kind of the way forward for metal music, funny enough. I also think one thing that metal really needs to do is ditch some of the like anti-Christian themes that are very common in many subgenres of metal, because in my opinion, it's alienating a lot of potential fans because there's a hell of a lot of overlap between Christians and metalheads. If you're in any kind of right-wing spheres, you will know this very well. I even growing up, like as a teenager, there was tons of guys who went to my church loved metal. So it's like there's such a big overlap between Christianity and metal. It's like, why piss off a good portion of your fan base like that? So really, I think that's a key thing is like ditch the anti-Christian themes. Because honestly, it's tired and it's cliched at this point, and it's also just alienating a big part of the potential fan base. I think another thing is that metal shouldn't try too hard to like appeal to non-metalheads. I think it's good to cross over a bit, but like gatekeeping does have its place. I will say that. Finally, when talking about my favorite types of metal, as I mentioned, I think prog metal is my favorite subgenre. Like a lot of stuff like Opeth, Between the Buried and Me, Devin Townsend, Tool, Dream Theater, Mastodon, Gojira, that kind of falls under the prog umbrella. I'd say second would be probably thrash metal. Like I do like, yeah, Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, and a lot of other thrash bands. Beyond that, I like a lot of like, I like some other bands that are like not prog, but maybe similar in some ways, like Agalloch, Alcest, bands like that. So I would say those are the types of metal that I like the most. And yes, some of the traditional metal too, like Dio and Judas Priest. But yeah, as a whole, and also groove metal, yeah, like Lamb of God, definitely. Oh, and one band I forgot to mention earlier when talking about the eras of metal is Machine Head. Yeah, they were a groove metal band that came a bit later. So they were kind of during the same phase as Lamb of God. Yeah, so the fourth phase. But yeah, I wouldn't call Machine Head one of my favorite bands, but they're a noteworthy band nonetheless. But yeah, that would be kind of in summary my thoughts on like the history of metal, where metal can go from here, and what my favorite subgenres of metal are. Because the bottom line is, I think with metal today, a lot of these legacy bands, they're going to start either getting becoming elderly, unable to play anymore. In some cases, the band members will die. And eventually everyone dies, obviously. But I mean, in some cases, it'll happen sooner, is what I mean. Unless, who knows, maybe some metal bands will discover the fountain of youth or whatever, or like through sheer badassery attain immortality. Who knows? But my point is, like, metal can't necessarily rest on its laurels forever. It can't rest on like Metallica and Slayer and Megadeth and Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, etc. forever. It has to evolve to some extent or risk becoming irrelevant or a thing of the past, or like something that people still like, but that is considered like an oldies genre, like a genre that's not really still making anything new, but that is still popular. Like something like, I don't know, like a lot of jazz and blues, for instance, or classic rock. Like I think metal does need to continue being relevant, and I think it's hard in this day and age because there's kind of the problem of too many bands, and it's like finding a needle in a haystack, which is the problem a lot of music faces these days with the advent of like the internet and the fact that it's like it's easier than ever before for people to create music, but as a result it's becoming harder to get recognized, like in the chatter of all this. So I feel like a lot of the legacy bands are still doing great, and that's great and all, but we can't rest on them forever. We can't rest on like any of like the earlier eras of metal forever. And I think some of the stuff I've talked about, like with like electronic music and stuff, is kind of the way forward. But that's just my opinion. So yeah, that's kind of my retrospective on metal as a whole.